Okay. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. It's my absolute pleasure to see so many familiar faces and to have you here today to talk with Jonathan Mallinson about his latest book. Just to let you know, again, you can pop your questions in the chat if you want us to ask Jonathan particular questions at the Q&A. So you can do it throughout the interview, and we will be happy to discuss them afterwards. So without further ado, my name is Laura. I work at Open Book Publishers as Library Relations Officer, but I also work in distribution and marketing. And I'm here with Jonathan Mallinson, author of William Moorcroft, Potter, Individuality by Design. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for being with us today. It's an absolute pleasure to have you, and I'm really excited for this conversation.
Well, thank you, Laura. Thank you for everything, of course. And looking at my screen, I now see 76 participants. I'm not even sure I ever had that number in a lecture. So I mean, this is really quite something. I know quite a number of the participants. There are plenty I don't know. May I just thank you all collectively, individually, for being here. I could almost start with a few closing remarks as well, one of which, of course, will be thank you for being here. But I don't know how this is going to pan out. I don't know if you all have the opportunity to ask the questions you'd like. If you don't like my answer, or you don't get a chance to ask a question, or you think of a question after the event, which happens to me all the time, and answers too for that matter, please don't hesitate to send me an email. I'll be delighted to carry on the conversation then. But I won't take any more time except to thank you again. I'm really overwhelmed in a quiet way by how many people are here, and I'm really grateful. I'd also actually, before I stop, is just to give a particular welcome to members of William Moorcroft's family. It's particularly important for me that many members of the family are here, and a very warm welcome to you. Okay, I'm done.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you who has decided to attend this event. So we will go ahead with the first question, if that's okay with you, Jonathan. So my first question is, can you provide an overview of William Moorcroft's significance in the world of pottery and the decorative arts during the late Victorian era and the early 20th century?
Yeah, I can give two answers to that. One is not very, and the other one is incredibly very. The not very answer is, if you mean by significance, to what extent did he do something which changed the way that things happened afterwards? The way pottery was made, or a kind of aesthetic which suddenly flourished as a result of what he did, then I think you've got to say his significance is slight. He wasn't, in that sense, another Josiah Wedgwood. He wasn't another William Morris. In that sense, he wasn't another Bernard Leach, the studio potter. But if you mean by, or understand by significance, did he do things that nobody else did and nobody else could do? Then I think you'd say, oh yeah, he did plenty. And to summarize it, I think he's best understood as occupying a place which really no other potter occupied. Put simply, occupying the space between, on the one hand, a studio, and on the other hand, a factory. And this is quite an interesting way of looking at it, in the sense that certainly after the First World War, the arts and crafts movement split. Or at least it went off in two directions, both of which as it were, the proponents of both of which movements would lay claim to the influence of William Morris. One of those was if you like, a sort of studio craftsman handwork line. And Bernard Leach says that, you know, William Morris really leads to the idea of the craftsman, because he's always contrasting craft with industrial production. The other direction is that of the industrial designer. Now there, the link back to the arts and crafts is more at the level of it is an artist's responsibility, social responsibility, even moral responsibility to, I don't know, make people's lives more beautiful. And not just one or two people. And the thing about the arts and crafts movement in its sort of heavy craft manifestation, and this was true even before the First World War, is that it tended to be luxury stuff. I mean, everyone thinks, oh yeah, arts and crafts, it's you know, simple for the people, but actually it wasn't in practice. It was very expensive stuff. And you know, people describe it as a form of, you know, conspicuous consumption. It was chic, but it wasn't populist. Whereas the industrial designer is all about using one's artistic talent to create designs which can then be made in larger quantities, usually in an industrial workplace. And what Moorcroft is, in a way, is he's between those two things. And we might in due course talk about how he does that, because it's very interesting and it's very unusual. But that, I think, is his distinctive quality. And it was recognized at the time. He was constantly being described as well, he wasn't described as a one-off. That wasn't exactly a sort of an Edwardian critical term, but that's what people meant. One critic said, he has ploughed a lone furrow. He's gone, you know, like Captain Kirk, boldly, and no one had ever gone there before. And that in a way is what he's doing. And one of the manifestations of that is that what he creates covers a very broad range. So at one end of the scale, you have got artworks, you've got stuff that was sought by museums, which was collected by connoisseurs of pottery. And at the other end, you've got functional objects. He made cups and saucers, he made inkwells, and he made lots of stuff in between those two things, where you might say, well, what is it? Do I use it, or do I look at it, or do I do both, or do I do neither and just keep it safe in a box? And that, I think, is the answer in a nutshell, really, to what he did. He just occupied a space. He created a space in a way which makes him a sort of well, he was described at his death as a post-Morrisite. So he wasn't a clone of William Morris. In fact, there are lots and lots that there's less in common with William Morris than there is in common, actually. But in terms of a desire, I suppose, the two sides of Morris, craft and a kind of sense of social responsibility, which in his practice was a contradiction because what he made was too expensive. In Moorcroft's case, you might argue that actually he out-Morrises Morris. He does what Morris might have imagined was possible, but didn't necessarily pull it off himself. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. So one of the really interesting things about this book is that it delves into Moorcroft's personal life or personal experience when it comes to archives, and you have research papers, personal letters, business correspondences, and I was wondering if you could give us an idea of like how it has helped you shape the character of Moorcroft himself, but also how do you see through this his own artistic evolution?
Well, the archive is just the most wonderful resource. I mean, I could spend the next hour and a half singing the praises of the archive. It's very diverse, and listeners will be able to hear me a little bit more on the subject in the other online interview, actually, which we've got online. I pick out one example of material, not all of which is to do with Moorcroft, but as much to do with the period, and that is papers, and they're scattered all over the place, but that they build a picture of what life was like for Moorcroft during the First World War. And this is a period that's very often skipped over in books or people talking about it. They'll say, well, he'd moved into his factory only the year before. I mean, it was like moving into a new house, and suddenly you find that, I don't know, I can't imagine what you suddenly find, but he had to adapt very quickly to a completely changed situation. And earlier commentators tend to say, yeah, he came through the war all right, actually he did very nicely. Now, on we go. And what you get from the archive is a sense of what it was like. I mean, just individual bits of paper. There's a card which is illustrated in the book, which is a work card for 2,000 inhalers. Moorcroft had to get a lot of War Office and army commissions, because this was one of the ways in which you kept your workforce. If you said to the Ministry of Recruitment, oh, actually, I can't spare any of my men of fighting age because I'm making decorative pots for, the country, it wouldn't have cut much ice. But if you said, I need men because I'm making inhalers for the army or whatever, then you had a better chance. It wasn't foolproof, but you had a better chance. There's a card, 2,000 inhalers. When are they needed? At once. At once. There's a form, again, I think it's illustrated in the book, which gives you a list of William's workforce. And you can see how tiny it has become. I mean, the archive has wages ledgers, and you can see how when he started, obviously his staff numbers build gradually, but by 1918, you have got people either sort of under the age of 15 or over the age of 50, and very few others. And what's so significant is that, these others he was hanging on to were perhaps the only, they're called handlers, the chap who makes handles for cups and all the rest of it. If he didn't have a handler, his production would have been, ruined, really, when it came to cups and mugs and all the rest of it. So it was very important. And there's a chilling official document from the recruitment agency who are going to pay a call on the factory, and it reminds employers that the army needs men in a steady flow, without which any other efforts are going to be wasted. A steady flow of men. So line your men up. I'm just going to take a handful, like going into a sweet shop. And it's absolutely chilling. And this is the background against which he is also making pottery, which is being described at the time as having a kind of dignified artistry. And you think, how does he do that? He's working under all these pressures, spending ages sort of writing letters to official departments to get to plead for key figures in the workforce, because it's like a chain, but there's no multitasking. So if one of your key links in the chain is lost to the army, the entire process comes to a grinding halt. And it brought out to me, I think, that, you know, we talk about Moorcroft as a potter and an artist and all the rest of it, but he was something else as well. I mean, he was determined, he was resourceful, he was very imaginative, and he wouldn't give up. He wouldn't give up. And that's the thing, I think, that I'd single out. The other stuff, I think, very briefly, would be there are a lot of notebooks and jottings and so on that really give you a sense of how he designed. And that too is precious. It's as if, I mean, you can get to see the pots. It's not very straightforward, but you can get to see the pots. But what you don't get to see is what lies behind them, if you like, the kind of motivation, the mindset, the processes, the priorities. And in diaries, in notebooks, in jottings, you get a lot of different insights into that. And that also, I think, is absolutely precious about the archive.
That is absolutely wonderful, and it must have been a really exciting experience to dive into all that information before going ahead with the book and just seeing like what the real situation was like, both for him personally and also the historic period that he was living in. So just you briefly mentioned in our first question that Moorcroft was somehow very different to some of his contemporaries or people that had come before him. For example, William Morris, you said like they had more things not in common than in common at the time. So my next question is a bit about that. My question is like, what do you think are the key features that distinguishes Moorcroft's work from those of his contemporaries? And also, at the same time, what are the things that make Moorcroft pottery so interesting for museums and collectors, even right now, even at this in 2023?
Yeah, well, I think I'd start by saying that the way he decorated his pottery was pretty much unparalleled. One critic, I mean, when you read the earliest reviews of his work, most of them devote an awful lot of the time to describing his technique. And they do that because they've never seen anything quite like it before. And again, we might talk about this in more detail later, but if I'm going to describe it in one sentence very quickly, he doesn't paint on a glazed surface or even on a fired surface, but he stains unfired clay with, you can call it ceramic color. I mean, it's metallic oxides, which when they're in the kiln are going to turn into the colors that you end up seeing. But what you see when you put it on is not what comes out the other end. And he was staining unfired clay. The reason why not many people could manage that is that the first firing of unfired clay is really very hot indeed. And most colors would simply disintegrate. They wouldn't stand up to it. But he was a chemist as well as an artist, and he developed over the 30, 40 years of his career, 45 years of his career, a range of colours that are distinctively his. I won't talk about slip decoration. We might talk about that later, but I'll stick with colour. The other thing I think that is different is the way, and this is more sort of artistic than technical, and that is that what is often said about what's called art pottery, which is really the word given to decorative pottery, I suppose before studio pottery, sort of the individual craftsman begins to emerge in the 1920s. But prior to that, one talks about art pottery. What's often said about art pottery is that basically it is a pot smothered in ornament of one kind or another. Either you get very sophisticated, sometimes glaze effects, but it's covering the pot, and actually what matters is the glaze rather than the form of the pot or whatever. Or you get pottery which in one way or another is seen as a kind of canvas, and somebody comes along and will draw a picture on it in some form or other, either using clay as a kind of oil paint or scratching it on or doing whatever. What critics noticed, again, right from the start of William's career, was the way that he integrated ornament, I'll call it decoration, but ornament and form. In other words, it was never thought of as a kind of applied decoration. Here's a pot. How can I make that pretty? I know, I'll draw a pattern or I'll draw a picture or whatever. Some art potters decorated blanks. That's to say, they buy their pots from somebody else. Even William de Morgan, who's often seen, well, he was as a very important, vaguely William Morris inspired. I mean, he was a friend of William Morris, potter, but the interest is in the decoration rather than the relationship between the decoration and the pot. In the case of Moorcroft, that is not the case. And I thought, just to give you a break from me talking, I've got, can you see this all right? This is a pot. And if you look at it, you might say, well, what is it actually? Because it doesn't present as a functional object necessarily. I mean, it could be a vase, I suppose, but it's not. It isn't the ideal or traditional shape for a vase. It isn't a bowl. It isn't a planter. I shouldn't think it'd be an absolutely awful planter. But it is what it is. It is what it is, which already is part of Moorcroft's imagination, I suppose. And it's a form that has just sort of emerged. It's quite an organic form. It's very it's very sort of well, bulbous, but one can imagine it sort of emerging up the potter's wheel. It's a very difficult pot to throw, I've been told. I don't know, but somebody once told me that this kind of almost spherical shape is very difficult to do. So you've got an organic form, and on it you've got toadstools. And if you look, say, at that view, it's striking the way that the crown of the toadstool and the contour of the pot sort of echo each other. They mirror each other in a way. There's a kind of coherence. But what's interesting is that it's not regular. This is not actually a repeating pattern. So what you see there gives you no idea of what you start to see round the other side. It's constantly varied. And so we've got harmony of decoration and form, but it isn't static, it isn't formal. It's almost as if anything is possible as you turn the pot around. And any kind of colour is possible as well. There are lots of colours here. There are reds and yellows and blues and greens. So what we have is a pot that's sort of embodying a kind of abundance, an abundance of nature. You've got toadstools springing up all over the place at different levels, and you've got colours varying all over the place. But what the pot does as well, I think, it captures fertility, but it also captures impermanence. Toadstools are, like all fungi, they're one of the more transient forms of organic material. And what Moorcroft does is convey, I think, that sense of impermanence in this permanent form. In the fungi themselves, if you look, there's one here, for instance, which is almost drained of colour. It's as if, you know, it may have started, you could imagine, with a bright red crown, but not now. It's sort of, it's fading from view. There's another one there. Look, you see the crown is sort of cut in half by the stalk of another one. It's and you can't tell which came first. You can't, I mean, it doesn't matter. What you're seeing is this natural growth in different stages of birth, flourishing, and decay. And it's the same with the colours. The colours are not static. The colours are not fixed, but you get yellow fading, draining into red, draining then into blue. And as they fall down, they sort of almost erase the toadstools beneath them. So what the pot is doing is that it's capturing an aspect of nature. It's capturing its brevity, its beauty, its naturalness in a form that has grown just as organically as the toadstools, and which has sprung to life in the kiln just as the toadstools spring to life, if you like, in nature. But this object, unlike the toadstools, is permanent. And just as, you know, if you go back the next year, you will see different toadstools, or the next day you'll see different toadstools. You go back to the pot and you will see something different. You'll see something new all the time. And that, I think, that's, I think, one of the most important characteristics. It's work which allows you to read it, not just to look at it. It's not just a decorative item that you think, oh, that's nice, it matches the curtains. It's something that compels your attention, or can do. It depends at what end of the scale it is. Now, another piece, and then I'll stop because I can get carried away, I'm afraid. A very different piece, this one. You might wonder what that is. The last one I said didn't present like a functional object. This one can only be a functional object. And what it is, in case you're wondering, is it's a tobacco jar or a humidor. And you can see that it's got this lid, and you put a damp sponge, I think, in there, and replace it. It keeps your tobacco nice and whatever, moist, I suppose, or whatever. It's clearly a functional object then. Now, you'll notice that I mean, I can hold it in one hand, but it's a lot easier to hold it in two hands, which already, I think, tells us something about the way. Another thing that's important about Moorcroft is the way he bridges this gap between functionality and ceramic art, shall we say. Because when you hold it in two hands, you realize how very tactile it is. It isn't the sort of thing, you're not likely to have that experience when you pick a toaster up, for instance, a toast rack, not a toaster, toast rack, you know, because you just pick it up. But this, to get it off the shelf, I might imagine, you would have to give yourself a kind of aesthetic pleasure first as you hold it. And you're almost enacting the pot. I mean, the potter will have held the pot like that, and you are doing this too. You're sort of being involved in a kind of, I don't know, recreation almost of its making. And I don't get carried away here, but there is something, I think, significant in that. And that, if you like, is a very nice prelude to the smoker's joy. You know, there's no, it's a kind of aesthetic aperitif. You know, you get the pleasure of holding before you even get to smoking what's inside. But it's not just a lidded pot, it's a decorated lidded pot. One can imagine that it was put on a shelf or in a prominent position, handy, no doubt. And the decoration, again, fits perfectly with the form. There's this sort of wreath of tree crowns going around the widest part, and it's regular, it's circular, it sort of envelops the shape. And the lid, I'll take it off and show you like that, is the same. You've got a comforting sort of circularity, which is harmonious, I suppose. And the motifs, I think, and the colours are significant. It's a very warm pot. The design was known variously as autumn tree or eventide, a kind of evening scene. Very restful again, and you can see a sort of movement from a darker ground at the bottom, moving up to these beautiful, warm, rich ochres and russet colours. It's all then creating a kind of relaxed atmosphere, an evening scene, when you could imagine the man of the house reaching it down to have his smoke. But it's significant, particularly, I think, when you think when it was made. And it was made in 1923 that this particular design was introduced. So not much more than 4 years after the armistice, after the end of the war. And the feeling of warmth and harmony which comes across is very much in keeping, I think, with that particular social and political context. It's a pot that carries a sense of things perhaps returning now to normal. when nature is not going to be blown to smithereens by bombs, but will be allowed to flourish, when you can enjoy the evening light and not wonder if there's going to be an air raid or worry about what is happening across the channel. There's a kind of security. A domestic item, then, yes. A functional item, yes. But it's a domestic item that's got a kind of, it captures a national mood. And it's a functional item that is speaking. And I think those are the qualities. Nobody would use this as a tobacco jar now, but a museum would love it because it speaks, I think. And that's what people notice now, just as they noticed then. But then, of course, they were buying it to use because they could afford to. We might talk about price later. But anyway, yeah, that's it. Sorry, I've gone on. Like, do you think we ought to skip what we were going to go on to, Laura?
No, actually, I was going to say, because we were talking, actually, my next question was a bit about like what you were saying now, how he adapted his style throughout the austerity aesthetics, the Second World War period, and how that was depicted on the pottery that he made. And that is a great example. We also have in an interview that you can watch at openbookpublishers.com too. Also another example of the punk grenades that Bas that we were looking at, and it's the same kind of like this kind of like very specific colors that sort of belong to him in a way, those kind of specific tones that are very representative of the time. So yeah, I was just going to ask you if you have any other key element that you will highlight from that era in which like he had to sort of like move from the arts and craft movement to the austerity aesthetics, and in what ways that has been shown both in the pottery but also in the records that you have worked with, or in his individual life, as you mentioned before, for example, when it comes to like hiring people for the workshop and specifics like that. So
well, I mean, the idea of adapting his style, I mean, another of the things I think that is noticed and appreciated about William Moorcroft is that there isn't a Moorcroft style. There isn't a Moorcroft look, or a William Moorcroft look. That was made 1898, 1899, roughly. That was made about 1937. So we're talking about 40 years. They're very different, obviously. I'm not going to, well, I will, yeah. They're very different. You might be surprised to know that they both have peacock motifs in them, which would be an answer to your question, how does he adapt? He does adapt. I mean, this is a piece of wonderful sort of Victorian exuberance, if you like. You've got peacocks springing up all over the place, but in a very regular way. You can see there, I mean, this is a repeating pattern, and you've got the prime one flanked by two smaller ones, and the sort of feathers are very stylized, and the whole thing is moving up in a confident, I don't know, unashamed, unapologetic display of ornament, really. And the peacock itself is associated with display, with the aesthetic movement, with art for art's sake, with beauty for its own sake. I mean, that vase could be, I mean, it could be a vase, but it doesn't have to be used as a vase. It could be a statement piece, or could have been seen as a statement piece. If you fast forward those 40 years, you can see actually here the peacock eye motif, and it's been completely reduced. It's very spare. There's nothing down here. I mean, the other pot, which actually, you know, you could see the one as essentially the same shape as the other. I mean, they're not very different from each other. But this one is speaking in a very different kind of idiom. It's very reductive, it's very stark, it's very spare. But it's also actually quite defiant, I think. He's removed all the ideas of growth and origin, but he's left the focal point of the peacock eye, as if to say, and this is a time when the question of how much art, I suppose, or certainly pottery design relied on ornament, on decoration. And in a lot of modernist aesthetics, what matters really is form. And studio potters tend to focus on form and texture, whereas Moorcroft is always leaving room for ornament, for decoration. And here you've got a pot which, in some respects, is like a bit of studio pottery in its colorings. The fact you can probably, if I hold it like that, you can probably see concentric lines around here. You may not see very clearly, and that's actually slightly undulating. And the reason it's there is that the pot hasn't been turned on a lathe, which is not what he did normally. Most of his pots are turned on a lathe to make them smooth, but that one hasn't, and it's got a kind of rustic element about it, but at the same time it's got decoration. It's tracing the same sort of upward movement as the Florian pot of 40 years earlier, and it's gloriously random. I mean, these motifs have got very little in common. They don't repeat. These don't line up with that, but he's putting decoration on it. I mean, beautifully. It's not haphazard, but there's a kind of defiant, almost mischievous demonstration of ornament. Look, there is a place for ornament in pottery made in a kind of modern style, and here it is. And that again is it's part of the way that he speaks to the times. He uses the vocabulary, if you like, the sort of imagery of the times, but he's not following a style. It's not. It speaks to the times, not because it's mimicking, fashionable motifs or familiar motifs, but he uses the tools, the motifs, to say something of his own. And I think that it's that, I call it individuality because a lot of contemporary critics call it individuality. It's that personality, I think, that endures. It doesn't matter what the period of the pot is. you get a sense of an individual artist there speaking. And I think you get it in those two very different examples of a peacock.
Completely agree. That's absolutely beautiful to see those two faces that were completely different from each other, but at the same time, there was a motive that was the continuation to it, and it's fantastic. So I think that we have finished with the questions, so I'm going to go to the Q&A, if that's okay. So I am going to ask you some of the questions that attendees have asked. We have one from Fran. It says, Jonathan, we were not some of the people who worked in his pottery during the women. Could he not have replaced the men who were taken by the army with the women at the time?
No, yeah, I mean, they absolutely were. Probably about half and half, actually, men and women. But there was quite a strict division between the kind of jobs that women did in potteries and the kind of jobs that men did. I won't say it would have been unheard of, for instance, to have a woman thrower, because there were examples in smaller potteries set up entirely by women. I've now had a blank on the name, but there is one, and somebody here, I'm sure, will know who it is. It was the Ravenscourt pottery. The name of the originator I've now completely forgotten. But that was unusual, actually. And the same, I mean, part of it was, I don't know, social prejudice. Part of it was concern for health and safety. And I mean, women often were, I mean, women were protected from doing heavy lifting, as we would call it now, I suppose. So things like moving the clay around to sort of whatever you called it, bonge it or something is a word, I can't remember what it is. All that kind of job, it would have been difficult, actually. They wouldn't have been trained. All of these jobs were highly skilled. And if you'd spent your time being a decorator, you couldn't just turn your hand to making handles. It wasn't quite as straightforward as that. But it's an interesting question, actually, and I don't think there are any examples of this sort of crossover.
Well,
but thank you for the question.
Actually, we have another question from Fran. So she's, or he, sorry, apologies, said, I am fascinated by what you said about impermanence. You said nothing about it, but were the pots of the same design always identical? Or have you found, like, depending where they are, they come out with the same design but different features?
The latter. I mean, absolutely the latter. I mean, partly, I suppose, inevitably, because when you do something by hand twice, it's never going to be exactly the same. Now, you might have to pore over it to see the differences, but it's like signing your name. It's like, I mean, anything you do more than once, you're going to be doing it differently, even microscopically differently, even if the starting point, that's to say, the outline of the design, which is traced onto each individual piece, even if that starting point were the same. But I have come upon examples of two pots that may be being exhibited as a pair, say, and you can look at them and say, well, isn't that funny? That flower's a bit different. I mean, it's slightly nerdy doing that, I have to say, but I have been known to do that. And it's part, I mean, it's part of what I was trying to capture in the subtitle of the book, Individuality by Design. You start with a design, but it's not a template. It's not hard and fast. And a very interesting thing about Moorcroft is that unlike a factory, unlike a manufacturer, where the concept of an imperfect item, a second, is second nature. That's what they do, because they think of themselves, and in some ways are expected to be, creating something that looks like the example in the catalogue. And if your thing doesn't look like that because, you know, that green's a bit darker than in the picture, or that, you know, you might send it back and say, just that's not what I bought. I bought one that looked like the picture. With Moorcroft, what you were buying was a unique piece. And it wasn't unique because it was totally different from any other piece. But the fact remained that it was simple. And one of the things I began to imagine as a good sort of analogy for this, in a way, is if you go to 2 performances of Hamlet, 2 performances, not 2 productions, go to 2 performances, the matinee and the evening, I mean, the next day, right next to each other, they're not going to be the same. But you're not going to say, just a minute, I don't like that one because they did something differently there, and I wanted one like this. You take them as well, as a performance, as something that is living, that is live. And Moorcroft's pots were like that. So a second, no, it doesn't apply any more than, you know, a fine artist would paint a picture and say, oh, that's not quite right. I didn't mean it to do that. He'd say, this is it, you know, take it or leave it. And then you've got to imagine the fine artist doing it sort of 5 more times. But it's the same notion, I think, of individuality not being something to apologize for, but actually being the essence of what's being done.
That's absolutely beautiful. So we have a question from William Moorcroft, grandson of William Moorcroft. William says, have you come across any information to establish how much input on each piece William had at McIntyre & Co? Because there seem to be more and more pots for sale online, with the sellers claiming it was William's own work, yet they are not signed. Is his signature the only guarantee that he worked on the piece himself for McIntyre?
The short answer to that is no, it isn't. It isn't a guarantee. Most of the functional ware, the tableware particularly, made at McIntyre's was not signed. And that's actually true of a lot of the tableware made when he moved into his own factory. For very practical reasons, I suspect, because he made a lot of tableware, and if you're going to initial every plate and so on, I mean, decorative plates, cabinet plates may be identified, but otherwise, I think as far as his input into McIntyre designs is concerned, you can be pretty certain. I mean, he was the only designer on the premises after his predecessor, with whom he overlapped for a few months, left in when would it be? I suppose late 1897, probably. it's pretty certain that anything emerging from the factory, from certainly when he took over as head of the ornamental pottery department in, I know, early 1898, will have been his design. It will have been his design. I think, I feel as though there were more elements in the question. So if this is an example, sir, if I've missed something out, please email me. Please don't hesitate. I'll give an answer to the bits I've forgotten if I have done.
So we have another question from Sheila Moorcroft. Sheila says, thank you again for all your work, Jonathan. Given the question about the role of women, perhaps you can say something about the role of her grandmother in the factory to illustrate their role, as well as their role, for example, in the decorating shop.
Well, you evoke a wonderful person, Sheila. Thank you for mentioning that. I speak a little bit in the book about William Moorcroft's first wife, who was a factory inspector called Florence Lovibond. And there's a very close relationship between Moorcroft and his first wife, with his second wife too, but this is much later in his career. And there is evidence, not as much as it would have been nice to see in the archive, of decorators reflecting on the atmosphere that was created in the works. They were never referred to as the factory, it was always the works, because Moorcroft, I think, didn't think of what he was doing as factory produced, and he didn't think of his workplace as a factory, and he didn't think of his, as he called them, his assistants or his co-workers as staff. All of those things, I think, mark him out as different. And there are occasional letters, or indeed recollections, that were collected by Moorcroft's daughter Beatrice, who assembled the archive in the first place. And she tracked down early decorators who looked back with great fondness about the very homely, totally non-production line industrial atmosphere that was created. And there are echoes. I quote one, I think, in the book, a memory of Florence going into the factory and putting flowers on the tables of the decorators because it was such a beautiful day, and inevitably they had to be indoors, but she didn't want them to be missing the beauties of the world outside. And so she was, well, the decorator in question said, you wouldn't expect that from, your average employer's wife. But Mrs. Moorcroft was not average. She was special. And later on, years later, when William is having quite a heated exchange of letters with one of his contacts at Liberty's, he says that he and his wife used to get up early so they could get a train to get into the factory in good time so that they can do whatever they needed to do that day to make it a pleasant place to work. And this was noticed. I mean, it isn't just in the archive that you get these sort of snippets of information, but critics' articles written about the new factory, or even 10 years later after the war, when it was still thought of as quite something out of the ordinary, it was described as the very opposite of a factory, because it was, well, if I say there was a kind of unhurried atmosphere, that's not to suggest that people are sort of lounging around doing, you know, a little bit of decoration when they fancy it. But it's not this sort of, oh, my job is to put a red splodge there, pass it on, do another red splodge, pass it on. But each of the decorators has got, if you like, their own creation, and they are making it. And going back to the earlier question, this is one of the reasons why another of the reasons why you aren't going to get two the same, because it isn't the same combination of people making each one of this seemingly identical piece, but you could get any number of decorators. And if you look, again, slightly nerdily, so that sort of reduces the number of people to my wife and me, probably, I don't know, but you can see indications of which decorator it was. They had different sort of ways of identifying themselves in ways which it's very difficult to put a name to. I mean, one knows the names of the decorators from the ledgers, but you can't put a cipher to a name very easily. But all that atmosphere, I think, springs from William Moorcroft and his wife, and it was a team effort. And when she died in 1926, they'd been in the factory for 13 years only. Well, he reacted no differently from anyone who is devoted to their partner and finds themselves separated. And he is a classic example of someone who can turn, I don't know, tragedy into creativity, because after it, from 27, I don't know, through to 31, 32 particularly, are years of the most amazing creativity. And you might think, well, he was trying to lose himself in work. And I think he probably was in a way, but he was doing it in a disciplined and determined way. I've said he was a very determined man, and he was. But yes, Florence Lovibond was a very special person. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So the next question is from Stephen Potter. So it says, William's father Thomas was also an artist. May there have been an influence? Is there any evidence of this?
That's a really interesting question. Thank you. He was an artist. He died, alas, when William was very young. His work was very highly regarded. He worked in a different style. If you look in the online supplement to the book, you will see one of the first pictures of additional pots that's illustrated as a cup and saucer designed by Thomas. Very different in style. I mean, it's a china cup and saucer, and it's almost sculpted. I mean, it's beautifully done. The influence, I think, would be in a sense of harmony, a sense of fluidity, a sense of, I don't know, design rightness in a way, rather than a specific style, and more a sort of a character, an authenticity, a sort of character, an integrity, all these sort of more general words, I think, rather than being able to point to something specific, except interestingly, and I'm not, this is really very much the beginning of a ponder that I've got. In the archive, I came across, and this may now be still with the family, because in a way it's a family piece as much as a piece of public interest. But there is a notebook of Thomas. It's not very big and it's not very full, but he mentions there forget-me-nots, and I don't know what the context is. I can't remember exactly what it is, but the word forget-me-not, it hasn't drawn a forget-me-not that I remember. And one of the things which is very striking and very unusual about a lot of William's designs is you get forget-me-nots cropping up. And I don't know, it might be fanciful. I have to stop myself very often for getting carried away when I start responding. And you might have thought already, you know, well, actually, it could have done that a bit earlier. It's a bit, you know, going a bit too far. But it is very striking the number of times William inserts forget-me-nots. When he designs the cornflower, he's got a ring of forget-me-nots in the middle of it. Well, it doesn't look a bit like a cornflower, but it's always there. In 1919, he made the most wonderful pot, big pot. We saw it once briefly, and it's a pot which is based on a watercolor that his father drew of an orchid, and it's a beautiful, beautiful object, and it's dated, I think, 1919, so just after the war. And when you can imagine him breathing a sigh of relief, he'd got through the war, and it was an act of communication, you might think, with his father. And interestingly, and I'll just interject this, although it's got only, well, it isn't irrelevant. It's just moving the same story a generation down. William's son, Walter Moorcroft, produced a pot right, not in the middle of his career, right at the end of his career, called After the Storm. And unlike William's orchid pot, After the Storm is not based on anything that William did, except that it is a landscape design, which was one of the characteristic designs of William. And what is so wonderful about that pot, After the Storm, is that it is exactly the shape of William's orchid pot. And you've got there a beautiful sense of father, son, son, or son, father, father again, dialogue through clay, when the recipient, if you like, of the message is not there to hear it, but it's put down for posterity. And there, I think, I'd say, yeah, I think there's a very big influence from father to son in that potting dynasty, which is the Moorcroft potting dynasty. And I think that's it begins with Thomas, as you rightly pointed out, and thank you for doing that. And it's very important.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So I think we have time for one last question, and we actually have one question in here, so I'll go ahead now. So this question is from Thomas Elliott. It says, "Hello, Jonathan. Lovely to see you again, and thank you for such a fascinating talk. As you mentioned, Moorcroft's work being the opposite of a factory, could you maybe say a bit more about the work having a social and moral aim as well? As someone who knows nothing about this, it sounds like the notion of individuality by design was a rejection of industrialization and mass production. Was it also a rejection of mechanization in warfare, for instance, or even of environmental collapse? Did Moorcroft think of his work in such terms in the way that Morris did?
I think the short answer to that is yes. I think he did, actually, and I think he did because, well, I think he did because he says it. He says it. Whether he thinks of it in those terms globally, if you like, I don't think he could have done, because he had a very small operation. It was more a question of this is the way I rate or give value or make sense of what I am doing in my small but bigger than studio-sized studio. I'm creating a working environment which is not the kind of industrial environment that Ruskin and Morris were railing against, which was a production line. And even, potteries at the time were mass producing things, either mass producing things with machinery or mass producing things with people, turning them out. Like I said, sort of slightly facetiously, I'm the red dotter, so there's a red dot, off it goes. I sit next to the green dotter, and on they go like a battery farm. He didn't want to do that, and he didn't do that, and people drew attention to that, and it was done deliberately. But equally, he valued what he did absolutely not actually as a way of making a lot of money. I mean, he recognized obviously that you had to keep the doors open and your staff employed. And one of the things that comes out from looking at the ledgers is the way that William bent over backwards to keep his staff in work. But he didn't keep them in work by mass producing stuff, tacky stuff that he knew would sell. So, I mean, he explicitly, and it's mentioned in, I forget which chapter, he's given an opportunity to let his ware be used as a free gift, with half a dozen chocolate coupons. And he says, no, I'm not going to do that, because it's almost as if, making that kind of stuff would be demeaning what he's doing and demeaning or reducing the pleasure of the decorators, to take the creativity out of it. But equally, he wanted to improve the quality of life of those who had his pots, or make their life more beautiful in one way or another. And he says in a letter to his daughter, a beautiful letter, and he says, if I can have given pleasure to someone with my work, then I won't have lived entirely in vain. One person would be enough. You might think, why didn't he throw all these letters away? The archive is full of letters, people writing to him saying, your work has changed my life. It's brought beauty. It's lifted the spirits. The conclusion of the book ends with two, 25 years apart, completely different background, exactly the same message. They weren't copying each other, but this was his contribution, if you like, to I don't know, the anti-industrial movement or whatever. You know, he's and it was, I mean, it's like in today's world, I'm going to turn off that light, or I'm not going to do something that might be bad for the environment. I'm not actually going to change very much, but I am doing something, however small. And I think that's how William felt. He didn't think of himself as a pioneer. He didn't have a banner saying, you know, follow my leader or follow me. I'm going to show you how we ought to behave, even though he does say, if only everybody, you know, were making beautiful things instead of horrible things, wouldn't it be a better place? But he didn't stand on a soapbox and proclaim it. He was in that sense, he was a very quiet man. It's like I said right at the very beginning, he wasn't a crusader like Morris or like Bernard Leach. He was just, well, he was who he was. He was William Moorcroft, and you know, that's quite something. But thank you. That's a good question. Thank you very much for that.
Well, I think with that, the session has finished. So thank you so much to everyone that has attended. Thank you so much, Jonathan. You know, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And yeah, discuss William Morris. So sorry, William Moorcroft. I have the Morris and Moorcroft in my brain. But yeah, no,
yep.
It's always a pleasure, and I always learn from every single conversation. So yeah, it's been delightful. So for everyone that has attended and has wants to download or access the book, I'm going to put the link in the chat. So it's an open access title. It's available to read for free on PDF and HTML format for anyone, but also you can purchase it in paperback and hardback, and also in a edition. So again, I'll leave the floor to you, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. Well, I'll finish with closing remarks again, but actually with some urgency now, because I can see the chat box is absolutely full of questions. Please, you can get my email address from the OBP page for the book. Just click on the bit that has my name, and it will take you to a university website, and my email address is there on that page. Please email the question and I will answer. I'm sorry I get carried away. I'm very sorry for talking so much. But thank you all again. I haven't been able to see you by face because I think I'd have found that absolutely devastating to have a whole screen of faces. So I haven't been able to see you by face, but I know you've all been there and I really do appreciate it. And I also finally want to thank OBP and Laura for arranging this and for everything else. It wouldn't have happened without you. And well, you know what I think. So thank you and good night, as they say. Yes.
Thank you so much.